Have you ever noticed that the deeper you think, the more alone you feel? Like, the more you understand about the world, the fewer people want to hear what you have to say. If that sounds familiar, you're not imagining it. Society has always been a little scared of deep thinkers, not because they're wrong, but because they see things that others would rather ignore. And history backs this up. Think about it. Socrates, Galileo, Tesla, these weren't just smart people. They were people who challenged the status quo. And what did they get in return? Ridicule, silence, rejection. It's not because they lacked intelligence. Quite the opposite. They were too smart to honest and to disruptive. Schopenhauer, one of the most brutally honest philosophers, once said that intelligence can feel more like a curse than a gift. Why? Because when you see the world too clearly, it becomes very hard to fit into it. But why is that? Why does society so often reject those who think differently? The answer runs deep into human psychology. Let's start with something called the mirror effect. It's this strange psychological phenomenon where, when we come across someone with intellectual depth, it's not just that they're offering new ideas. They're holding up a mirror to everyone around them, and that mirror doesn't just reflect brilliance, it reflects everyone else's limitations. And people really don't like that. Here's what's interesting. When you meet someone who is physically stronger than you might admire them, maybe even feel inspired. Same goes for someone who's rich. There might be envy. Sure, but not necessarily offense. These kinds of superiority, strength, wealth, beauty are external. They don't usually make people feel like their identity is under attack. But intelligence, that hits differently. We define ourselves by our thoughts, our beliefs, our worldview. So, when someone comes along with a more refined understanding, someone who challenges what we've always accepted as true, it can feel like a direct hit to our identity. People don't resist deep thinkers because they're arrogant. They resist them because they make others question themselves. This is why deep thinkers throughout history have so often been sidelined. They don't just challenge opinions, they challenge egos. And people will protect their egos at almost any cost. You've probably experienced this firsthand. Maybe you've tried bringing up a complex or philosophical idea in a conversation and suddenly people go silent. Or they change the subject, or they laugh it off like it's too deep for the moment. It's not a coincidence. That's a defense mechanism. People often reject depth not because they're disinterested, but because they feel threatened. This dynamic plays out everywhere. In casual conversations, in schools, at work, online. And what is even more frustrating is that it is not always the most intelligent or insightful voices that get the most attention. In fact, it's often the opposite. Confidence, not intelligence, tends to win people over. You could be the smartest person in the room, but if someone else speaks with more confidence, more certainty, even if what they're saying is shallow or wrong, they're more likely to be listened to. That's just how social psychology works. Charisma and certainty are often more persuasive than truth. That's why you see motivational speakers, populist leaders, and viral influencers blowing up by telling people what they want to hear. Meanwhile, deep thinkers, people who talk with nuance, who don't pretend to have all the answers, often struggle to gain a following. This is what you could call the paradox of intelligence. The more someone seeks truth, the more disconnected they become from the mainstream. And it's not just a social thing, it's biological. Modern neuroscience has actually shown that when people feel intellectually threatened, their amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for fear and threat detection, lights up. In other words, when someone says something that makes us feel intellectually inadequate, our brain treats it like a threat, a literal danger. It activates the same response we'd have to a physical threat. Why? Because for most of human history, our survival didn't depend on being the smartest person in the tribe, it depended on belonging to the tribe. Standing out wasn't safe. Being too different, even if you were right, could get you exiled or worse. So our brains evolved to prioritize group harmony over individual insight. We're hardwired to value fitting in over standing out. So when a deep thinker enters a social space, even if they're not trying to disrupt anything, their presence naturally stirs the waters. They ask questions people aren't ready to ask. They challenge assumptions that feel sacred, and because of that, people go into defense mode. Not always consciously, but it happens. This explains why deep thinkers often feel more at ease in one-on-one conversations than in group settings. A 2021 study from Stanford even confirmed this. People are far less threatened by intellectuals in private than in groups. In a group, everything becomes about social status. And if someone feels like their status is being threatened, if they're being outshined intellectually, they'll instinctively try to shut it down, undermining, excluding, changing the topic. It is all part of the social dance people do to protect their place in the group hierarchy. Psychologists have identified several cognitive biases that make this even worse. The Dunning-Kruger effect. People with low ability often think they know more than they do, while highly intelligent people tend to doubt themselves. This creates friction. Those who are less informed often dismiss those who are deeply informed, simply because they overestimate their own understanding. Status quo bias. We're psychologically drawn to familiar ideas. New or complex thoughts make us uncomfortable. So, when a deep thinker introduces something challenging, the brain resists. Not because it's wrong, but because it's unfamiliar. The backfire effect. When confronted with evidence that contradicts our beliefs, we often double down instead of rethinking. That's why introducing uncomfortable truths can make people even more defensive, not more open-minded. Now add social media into the mix and things get even trickier. Platforms like YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, they don't reward depth. They reward engagement. Controversial, emotional, and entertaining content spreads faster than anything thoughtful or nuanced. So what happens? The most viral posts are the simplest, catchiest, and often the most misleading. Meanwhile, if you're someone who likes to explore complex ideas, it's hard to package your thoughts into 15-second sound bites. It's hard to go viral when your message requires more than a quick scroll. That's the modern reality. Entertainment spreads. Enlightenment struggles. And this isn't just about online life. It starts way earlier at school. We like to think education is about nurturing intelligence. But let's be honest, schools reward obedience more than originality. The kids who memorize well, follow directions, and don't challenge the system get the good grades. The ones who ask uncomfortable questions, they're labeled as troublemakers. The same goes for most workplaces. Corporations don't usually promote the most creative or critical thinkers, they promote those who fit the culture, follow the rules, and don't rock the boat. Even in politics, this pattern holds. Leaders who appeal to emotion and give people what they want to hear tend to beat those who speak hard truths. Logic and honesty don't always win elections. Simplicity and certainty do. So, what does this mean for deep thinkers? It means you're not crazy for feeling out of place. You're not broken for thinking differently. In fact, you're a part of a long tradition of people who saw things others couldn't or wouldn't see. And yes, it's isolating. Yes, it can feel like no one understands you. But you're not alone. You're just ahead of your time. If you've ever felt like your thoughts were too much for the room, like your questions, your observations, your need for depth made others uncomfortable, there's a reason for that. And it's not that you're wrong, it's that you're early. History is full of deep thinkers who were misunderstood in their own time. People like Socrates, Galileo, Nietzsche, Tesla. These were not fringe characters, they were the minds that reshaped our understanding of reality. And yet, they weren't celebrated during their lifetimes. Most were punished, silenced, forgotten. Why? Because their ideas arrived before society was ready. Take Socrates. He didn't write books or build inventions, he asked questions, difficult questions. He challenged people to think for themselves, to examine their lives, their beliefs, their assumptions, and for that, the state put him on trial, not for any violent crime but for corrupting the youth and disrespecting tradition. In truth, his crime was intellectual honesty. Instead of escaping, Socrates drank poison. His final words? The unexamined life is not worth living. His death wasn't just a punishment, it was a warning. Society fears those who question its foundations. Then there's Galileo, the man who looked through a telescope and saw what no one else wanted to admit. The Earth is not the center of the universe, a simple truth, but a dangerous one, because it undermined the power of the church, the institution that shaped everyone's worldview at the time. Galileo was forced to deny his findings, to label his own truth as heresy. He spent the rest of his life under house arrest. His discoveries, of course, were eventually accepted, but only after the damage had been done. Or consider Nietzsche, a philosopher who dared to say what others were too afraid to admit, that traditional morality was built on illusions, that society clings to comforting lies, that true strength comes from creating your own values in a world that doesn't make sense. At the time, people thought he was mad. His works were misunderstood, dismissed. But now, his ideas formed the backbone of modern existentialism, psychology, literature. He saw the cracks in society's foundation long before anyone else did. Tesla's story is even more tragic. A visionary inventor who imagined a world powered by free, wireless energy. He had the genius to make it real, but not the backing. Because powerful men like Thomas Edison and J.P. Morgan didn't want free energy, they wanted profit. Tesla's ideas were shut down. He died alone in a New York hotel, penniless and forgotten, while others built fortunes on technologies he pioneered. And then there's Alan Turing, the man who cracked the Nazi code and helped end World War II. His work laid the foundation for modern computing, but because of his sexuality, he was persecuted, arrested, chemically castrated. He took his own life at 41. Today, he's a hero. Back then, he was discarded. Even earlier in history, we find figures like Hypatia of Alexandria, a brilliant female philosopher and mathematician who taught logic and astronomy in a time when women were rarely allowed to speak, let alone teach. Her intellect threatened the religious authorities of ancient Rome. In 15 AD, a mob brutally murdered her because she represented reason in a world dominated by fear. All of these stories point to the same pattern. When thinkers challenge the norm, they are pushed to the fringes, not because they're wrong, but because they threaten the comfort of the collective. That's the real issue. Society doesn't actually fear intelligence, it fears what intelligence reveals. Because intelligence, when it's honest, doesn't reinforce the world as it is. It questions it. It disrupts it. And disruption is uncomfortable, especially when it challenges the systems people depend on: religion, government, education, family traditions. That's why deep thinkers often get labeled as difficult or crazy or out of touch. It's a defense mechanism. It's easier to dismiss someone than to sit with the discomfort they bring. But here's the important truth. Being misunderstood doesn't mean you're wrong. In fact, the opposite is often true. Being misunderstood can mean you're simply too far ahead. And that leads to a natural question. Are deep thinkers doomed to loneliness? The answer is no, not necessarily. But you do need to understand the world you're operating in. You can't expect society to embrace your depth immediately. Instead, you have to learn how to navigate it wisely. Let's go back to Schopenhauer, a philosopher who didn't sugarcoat the challenges of being intelligent. He believed that the smarter you are, the harder it is to connect with society, because intelligence leads to awareness, and awareness often leads to alienation. According to Schopenhauer, most people are driven by what he called the will to live, a blind, instinctive force that pushes us toward comfort, pleasure, and survival. Deep thinkers, on the other hand, often develop something different: the will to truth. They want to understand reality, no matter how painful or isolating that journey is. And this creates a massive disconnect, where most people find joy in small talk, entertainment, or chasing success. Deep thinkers often feel disillusioned. They see through the games. They recognize the emptiness behind the ambition, and that can make them feel detached from everyday life. Schopenhauer saw this clearly. He believed that the more someone understands human nature, the harder it is to relate to people, because so much of society is built on appearances, on politeness, on shared illusions. And deep thinkers see through all of that. They crave depth, but the world is set up for simplicity. They see how much of human behavior is driven by ego, by fear, by insecurity. They notice how people chase goals without ever asking why, how they follow routines that bring no real joy, how they avoid hard questions by burying themselves in distractions. And once you see all that, it's hard to unsee it. That's why intelligence can feel like a curse. It doesn't just give you answers, it gives you clarity. And clarity can be painful. So, what can deep thinkers do? Schopenhauer didn't just point out the problem, he offered guidance. 1. Embrace solitude. He believed solitude wasn't a punishment, it was a privilege. When you're alone, you're free to think, to create, to explore ideas without resistance. Instead of chasing validation from people who don't understand you, use that time to nurture your inner world. 2. Find like-minded people. Don't waste your energy trying to fit into spaces that aren't built for depth. Seek out those who think like you, whether through books, conversations, online communities, or intellectual circles. Quality matters more than quantity when it comes to connection. 3. Be strategic with your insights. Not everyone is ready for deep truth, and that's okay. Schopenhauer advised being selective with what you share and who you share it with. Observe society. Learn how it works. And choose your moments wisely. Sometimes, silence is smarter than explanation. And most importantly, 4. Learn to communicate your depth. Einstein once said, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. That doesn't mean you have to dump things down, but it does mean learning how to bridge the gap between where you are and where others are. The best deep thinkers are translators. They take complex, abstract truths and make them feel real to people who might otherwise turn away. If you can do that, you're not just thinking deeply, you're making an impact. Because here's the thing, society needs deep thinkers. We just don't always realize it in the moment. The same people who are rejected today are often revered tomorrow. Their ideas, once seen as dangerous, become the very foundation for progress. That's the cycle. And while it might not make things easier right now, it should give you hope. Because you're not alone in your thoughts. You're just ahead of the curve. So, if society doesn't always welcome deep thinkers in the moment, what can you do if you're one of them? First, understand this. The resistance you face isn't always personal. Most of the time, it's psychological, it's cultural, it's systemic. Society isn't built to nurture deep thought. It's built to maintain stability. Most people prefer comfort over truth. That's why shallow conversations dominate social settings. Simple ideas get the most attention, and people cling to familiar beliefs even when they're outdated or harmful. Why? Because of how the human mind is wired. Psychologists call it cognitive ease. Our brains naturally prefer information that's simple, familiar, and easy to digest. Complex ideas, those require more mental effort, and effort feels like danger to a brain evolved for survival. So, when someone presents a new, nuanced perspective, people instinctively push back, not because it's wrong, but because it's uncomfortable. There's also system justification theory, which explains why people defend the status quo even when it doesn't serve them. Challenging the system, whether it's political, religious, or social, forces people to confront uncertainty, and uncertainty is scary. So instead of embracing change, most people rationalize what already exists. It's always been this way. That's just how things work. These are common defenses against discomfort. Add to that groupthink, the tendency for people to align with group consensus even if they disagree internally, and you have a culture that actively resists intellectual dissent. This is why most schools and workplaces don't truly reward deep thinking. They might claim to value critical thought, but in practice, they reward conformity. In schools, the system favors those who memorize and repeat information over those who ask disruptive questions. The students who color inside the lines get straight A's. The ones who challenge authority, they're often labeled as difficult. In the corporate world, it's much the same. Innovation is a buzzword, but conformity is what actually gets promoted. Companies say they want new ideas, but only if those ideas don't threaten the existing structure. So, the smartest, most creative employee. Why? Because of how the human mind is wired. Psychologists call it cognitive ease. Our brains naturally prefer information that's simple, familiar, and easy to digest. Complex ideas, those require more mental effort, and effort feels like danger to a brain evolved for survival. So, when someone presents a new, nuanced perspective, people instinctively push back not because it's wrong, but because it's uncomfortable. There's also system justification theory, which explains why people defend the status quo even when it doesn't serve them, challenging the system whether it's political, religious, or social forces people to confront uncertainty. And uncertainty is scary. So instead of embracing change, most people rationalize what already exists. It's always been this way. That's just how things work. These are common defenses against discomfort. Add to that groupthink the tendency for people to align with group consensus even if they disagree internally, and you have a culture that actively resists intellectual dissent. This is why most schools and workplaces don't truly reward deep thinking. They might claim to value critical thought, but in practice, they reward conformity. In schools, the system favors those who memorize and repeat information over those who ask disruptive questions. The students who color inside the lines get straight A's. The ones who challenge authority, they're often labeled as difficult. In the corporate world, it's much the same. Innovation is a buzzword, but conformity is what actually gets promoted. Companies say they want new ideas, but only if those ideas don't threaten the existing structure. So, the smartest, most creative employees often get overlooked in favor of those who fit the culture. Politics? It's arguably worse. Leaders who base their arguments on logic, reason, and long-term thinking often lose to those who appeal to emotion, simplicity, and short-term gratification. The truth isn't always popular, especially when it's uncomfortable. And this isn't just a modern problem. It's been this way throughout history. The pattern is predictable. A deep thinker introduces a disruptive idea, gives society resists, gives the thinkers rejected, gives decades later, society celebrates their work once it's safe. Just look at the legacy of thinkers like Galileo, Tesla, Turing. While they were alive, their ideas were feared. Today, their names are revered. The same goes for artists and writers like Van Gogh, Kafka, and Emily Dickinson, people whose genius wasn't recognized until long after they were gone. Why? Because society doesn't embrace intelligence when it challenges the norm. It only celebrates it in hindsight, once the threat has passed. That's the reality deep thinkers need to understand. It's not that your thoughts aren't valuable. It's that they're often ahead of their time. So, what can you do? You don't need to dumb yourself down. You don't need to abandon your ideas. You don't need to give up, but you do need to be strategic. Here's how to survive and thrive as a deep thinker in a world that often resists depth. 1. Choose your audience wisely. Not every place or person is ready for deep conversation, and that's okay. Save your most profound thoughts for the people who genuinely want to engage. Don't waste your energy trying to convince those who've already made up their minds. You don't need 1 million people to understand you, just the right ones. 2. Build your own intellectual circles throughout history. Great thinkers have formed communities, sometimes in salons, sometimes in books, sometimes online. Seek out others who value critical thought. Join forums, start a podcast, comment on deep videos, host local meetups, create the space you've been searching for. The internet, for all its flaws, has made it easier than ever to find like-minded people. You're not alone. You just haven't found your tribe yet. 3. Balance clarity with complexity. As we mentioned earlier, Einstein said, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. That doesn't mean oversimplify your ideas, it means communicate them clearly. Learn how to bridge the gap between where you are and where others are. Use metaphors, analogies, stories. Don't lose the depth but guide others into it. If you want to make a real impact, being right isn't enough. You have to make your ideas relatable. 4. Be comfortable with solitude. This one's tough but essential. Deep thinkers often feel alone because they are walking a different path, but solitude doesn't have to be suffering. It can be your most powerful asset. Use it. Read, write, reflect, create, build. Let solitude sharpen your mind, deepen your creativity, and connect you to something greater than the noise of everyday life. Remember, some of the greatest ideas in human history were born in silence. If this video helped you in any way, please like, share, and subscribe. This is just one part of the journey. There's more in the next video, and it's an important step. Real change happens when you keep going, one step at a time. See you in the next one.